April 28, 1945. Mussolini was captured. He was betrayed and alone. His power had ended. Chaos filled the streets. People threw stones and spat on him. Anger ran through the crowd. Pride was shattered. His reign ended brutally, and revenge was served. These were Mussolini's final hours, raw, brutal, unforgettable. April 28, 1945. The world was changing fast. Benito Mussolini, Italy's ruthless dictator, was on the run. The Allies were closing in. His empire of fear was collapsing. He tried to escape to Switzerland with his mistress, Clara Petacci, but betrayal awaited. Italian partisans caught him in the village of Dongo. There was no mercy. Mussolini was no longer the man who had ruled Italy with iron and terror. He was vulnerable, alone, afraid. The partisans decided his fate quickly. They would not let him live to escape justice. His execution was swift, brutal, final. Mussolini and Petacci faced the firing squad. Their lives ended in an instant. Then came the public reckoning. Their bodies were transported to Milan. Piazzale Loreto, the same square where fascist atrocities had occurred, became the stage for history's rawest display. Hanging upside down, exposed to the crowd, Mussolini and Petacci became symbols of the nation's fury. In this video, we will uncover Mussolini's last hours, explore his capture, reveal the execution that shocked Italy, and show why his final moments became one of history's most brutal spectacles. Chapter 1. The Capture. April 27, 1945. Mussolini and Clara Petacci were fleeing north toward Switzerland. The Allies were advancing, and the fascist regime was collapsing. Disguised in German coats, they moved quietly through small villages and rural roads, hoping to avoid detection. Their escape ended in the village of Dongo, on the western shore of Lake Como. Italian partisans, organized and determined, recognized Mussolini despite his disguise. The dictator and Petacci were arrested without resistance. There was no negotiation. Their capture was immediate and final. The couple was taken to a nearby farmhouse where the partisans debated what to do. Mussolini's past actions had left a clear record: years of repression, executions, and collaboration with Nazi Germany. The partisans concluded that his death was necessary. Preparations began for the execution. Mussolini and Petacci were moved from the farmhouse to a secluded location. The route was chosen to avoid witnesses and to maintain control. The partisans were precise and efficient, ensuring that there would be no chance for escape. At this stage, Mussolini no longer had influence or options. The dictator who had once ruled Italy with absolute authority was now fully under the control of those who had opposed him for years. His capture marked the collapse of the fascist hierarchy. The arrest itself was methodical. Mussolini and Petacci were transported toward Lake Como, where they would face the firing squad. This moment was not a spectacle. It was the execution of a decision made months earlier, based on justice and practicality. The capture of Mussolini ended his attempt to flee and secured the final stage of his life. It demonstrated the power shift in Italy. The fascist regime was finished, and the partisans had the authority to enforce justice. Mussolini's capture was not only a military or political event, it was a turning point in Italian history. By the time the couple left Dongo, the stage was set for the next step, the execution. Mussolini's capture had removed him from power, but the consequences of his actions would follow immediately. The process that began in Dongo would culminate in a public and symbolic reckoning in Milan. The operation was straightforward, without drama or hesitation. Mussolini and Petacci were moved efficiently and securely. The partisans maintained control, ensuring that their orders were followed and that the consequences of years of fascist rule were executed precisely. This moment in Dongo ended Mussolini's ability to influence events. He was no longer a figure of authority. He was a prisoner, awaiting the consequences determined by those who had resisted his regime. His capture was decisive, signaling the definitive collapse of fascist power in northern Italy. Chapter 2. The Execution. April 28, 1945. Mussolini and Clara Petacci were moved from the farmhouse near Dongo to a secluded location outside the town. The partisans who had captured them maintained control at every step. Security and precision were the priorities. Every measure was taken to ensure that the dictator and his companion could not escape or interfere with the process. The location chosen was simple but effective. It provided isolation and minimal chance of interruption. The partisans had selected it carefully. It was near Lake Como, a short distance from Dongo, with natural barriers and clear visibility. The site ensured that the execution could be carried out efficiently and without external interference. Mussolini's attire, his German greatcoat, was removed. He was prepared for the firing squad. Petacci was positioned alongside him. Both faced the reality of the situation. There was no room for negotiation or delay. The partisans had resolved to conclude the dictator's final chapter. The firing squad assembled. These were the same partisans who had arrested Mussolini hours earlier. The men were organized, disciplined, and methodical. They were not acting impulsively. Their actions followed a plan developed over weeks. Every step was deliberate, designed to ensure the completion of the execution with no room for error. Mussolini was instructed to stand against a wall. Petacci was placed nearby. The squad took position at a distance appropriate for effectiveness. Their instructions were precise. Ensure death without complications. The partisans had studied similar executions, aware that mistakes could allow survival or compromise security. The execution itself was brief. Mussolini fell to the bullets. Petacci fell beside him. Each shot had been carefully aimed. The sequence was controlled. There was no spectacle in the act itself, only the methodical conclusion of a process determined long before. After the shots were fired, the partisans verified that both were dead. Mussolini's life of influence, authority, and command had ended in an instant. Petacci's life, caught in proximity to power and circumstance, ended at the same time. The executions concluded without incident as intended. Once verified, the bodies were prepared for transport. Mussolini and Petacci were moved from the site to vehicles waiting nearby. The operation was carried out quickly to avoid attracting attention or creating unrest among nearby populations. Speed and discretion remained priorities. The transportation route led to Milan. Partisans were in communication to ensure that the path remained clear. They avoided towns and checkpoints that might pose a risk. The bodies were moved efficiently, with focus on completing the next stage of the plan, public display in Piazzale Loreto. Along the route, there was minimal interaction with civilians. The partisans maintained a controlled environment, preventing panic or interference. The priority was to maintain order while completing the final phase of Mussolini's life. Security, discipline, and adherence to the plan defined every action. Milan awaited. Piazzale Loreto, a site of past fascist executions and public demonstrations, was chosen as the place where Mussolini's final presence would be displayed. The square held symbolic significance. It reinforced the consequences of the fascist regime. It was a location of historical resonance, selected to communicate both justice and authority. Upon arrival in Milan, preparations were made to display the bodies. Mussolini and Petacci were secured to a metal girder. They were positioned upside down. This method had been chosen deliberately to serve as a visible symbol of the end of their influence and to allow the public to witness the conclusion of the dictator's life. The crowd gathered quickly. The display was organized and partisans managed the perimeter. Civilians, aware of Mussolini's capture and execution, arrived to see the result. The square's significance amplified the event, transforming it from a simple execution to a national statement. The public display was deliberate. The partisans ensured that the bodies remained accessible for observation while maintaining control over the environment. Stones and debris were expected, as was public reaction, but the partisans allowed it to occur within bounds. This was part of demonstrating authority and closure. During the display, photographs and reports were taken. News of the execution spread quickly throughout Italy and abroad. Mussolini's death became a defining moment, widely documented and interpreted in various ways. The execution and display were not simply local events, they were historical milestones. The method of display, upside down, suspended, served multiple purposes. It communicated the finality of Mussolini's life and symbolized the collapse of his regime. It allowed the public to confront the tangible end of a figure who had ruled through fear and repression. The visual impact was immediate and memorable. Petacci's presence alongside Mussolini reinforced the personal dimension of the event. Their intertwined fates became part of the historical record. She was not simply collateral. Her execution and display were inseparable from Mussolini's, reflecting the consequences of association with power. The partisans maintained control throughout. They ensured no disruptions occurred that could compromise the display. They managed the crowd, preventing potential conflicts or attempts to intervene. The operation from execution to public display was precise and methodical. The broader context of the execution was significant. Mussolini's death marked the definitive end of fascist authority in northern Italy. It demonstrated that ordinary Italians, through organized resistance, could enforce accountability. The event communicated a clear historical message. The collapse of tyranny was irreversible. International reaction followed. News agencies reported the execution, emphasizing both the method and the symbolic aspects. Mussolini's death became an example of wartime justice and accountability. Analysts debated the implications, but there was consensus that the dictator's life had ended conclusively. The execution and subsequent display also influenced the immediate political environment in Italy. It signaled the transfer of authority from fascist leaders to partisan-controlled regions. It demonstrated that governance and enforcement of justice could emerge from organized civilian action rather than formal armies. Mussolini's capture and execution were therefore more than personal events. They were acts that shaped the political landscape. They illustrated the consequences of absolute power and the capacity of local forces to effect historical change. By the end of April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were dead, their bodies displayed, and the partisans had completed their mission. The dictator's life was finished. The regime he had led for more than 2 decades no longer existed in any operational form. His influence had ended, and Italy began to move toward a post-fascist reality. The execution marked the transition from the chaos of the final days of war to a period of reckoning. Mussolini's life, once commanding armies and shaping policy, had ended in a controlled, deliberate process carried out by those who had opposed him. The event was methodical, precise, and historically significant. Every detail of the execution was designed for certainty. There was no improvisation, no last-minute decision-making. The partisans acted with clear intent, ensuring that Mussolini and Petacci would not survive, and that their deaths would serve as both practical and symbolic conclusions. The efficiency of the operation reflected careful planning, disciplined execution, and the understanding that history would remember these final moments. Mussolini's life ended as decisively as his influence had, reinforcing the collapse of a regime and the assertion of accountability by ordinary citizens. The execution itself was brief, but its impact extended far beyond that morning. It established a framework for post-war justice in Italy, influenced international perceptions of the fall of fascism, and became a reference point for understanding the consequences of dictatorship. By the evening of April 28th, Mussolini and Petacci's deaths had been secured, their bodies prepared for display, and their place in history cemented. The event closed the first chapter of Italy's post-fascist reckoning and set the stage for the public and symbolic aftermath in Milan. Chapter 3, the public display in Milan. After the execution near Dongo, Mussolini and Clara Petacci's bodies were transported to Milan. The destination was Piazzale Loreto, a location with deep historical significance. The square had already been a site of fascist terror, where political prisoners were executed and public displays of power enforced obedience. It was here that Mussolini's final presence would be seen by the Italian public, a symbolic statement of the end of his regime. The partisans moved methodically. Security remained a priority. Vehicles transported the bodies through quiet streets, avoiding major thoroughfares that might disrupt the operation. Each step of the journey was planned. Control was maintained to prevent interference or unanticipated complications. The goal was clear: complete the display efficiently and decisively. Upon arrival in Milan, preparations began immediately. A metal girder had been arranged, intended to suspend the bodies. Mussolini and Petacci were positioned upside down. This method served both practical and symbolic purposes. It allowed the public to observe the dictator directly while simultaneously demonstrating the absolute conclusion of his power. The square gradually filled. Citizens, aware of the dictator's death, gathered in large numbers. The partisans organized the perimeter, ensuring that the crowd could witness the event without interference. Photographers documented the scene. News reporters arrived. Mussolini's death and the method of display became a visual and historical record. Observers noted the precision of the operation. The bodies were secured firmly to the girder. Mussolini's uniform and appearance remained recognizable, maintaining the clarity of identification. Petacci was displayed alongside him. Their intertwined fates had been inseparable from capture to death. The display communicated both the collapse of fascist authority and the consequences of close association with power. The crowd reacted in various ways. Some shouted in anger, others moved silently, observing the event. Stones were thrown at the bodies. Some people spat on them. These actions reflected years of repression, terror, and personal suffering caused by Mussolini's regime. The public interaction was unstructured but expected. The partisans allowed the crowd-controlled access, balancing order with the symbolic power of public witnessing. The choice of Piazzale Loreto amplified the impact. The square had been used months earlier to display 15 partisans executed by fascist forces. Mussolini's display inverted that earlier event. The position of the bodies was deliberate. It underscored the reversal of power. The oppressor was now subject to the authority of the people he had once controlled. International attention followed quickly. Photographs were circulated throughout Europe and the United States. Mussolini's image, upside down and suspended, became a reference point in historical analysis. Analysts described the display as a stark symbol of retribution, an illustration of the fall of a dictator, and a warning to surviving fascists. The display was not intended as entertainment. It was a controlled, deliberate act of symbolism. The partisans maintained perimeter security, preventing escalation or chaos. Civilians could interact in limited ways, such as throwing stones or vocalizing anger, but the operation remained organized. Every measure reinforced authority and the finality of Mussolini's life. Mussolini's presence in the square carried multiple messages. First, it demonstrated that the fascist regime no longer held control. Second, it reinforced the consequences of tyranny and collaboration with oppressive powers. Third, it communicated a sense of closure for victims and witnesses. Each aspect was intentional. The public display was as much about historical record as it was about immediate justice. Petacci's presence reinforced the broader point. Her death symbolized the consequences of association with power. It demonstrated that those close to Mussolini were inseparable from the consequences of his decisions. The display ensured historical clarity. Both were subjects of the regime and therefore both faced its consequences. The sequence of the display was documented in detail. Newspapers published images, and foreign correspondents reported on the symbolic nature of the event. The visual record reinforced the narrative that Mussolini's dictatorship had ended completely. It communicated to both Italians and the international community that the era of fascist authority in Italy was over. The public's interaction with the bodies also had historical significance. Stones thrown, spitting, and verbal expressions were acts of reclaiming power. Citizens who had lived under repression were given a chance to assert themselves physically and symbolically. The display provided tangible evidence of the regime's collapse. Piazzale Loreto's prior history made it a natural choice. The square had been central to fascist control. Displaying Mussolini there completed a cycle. Those who had suffered under the regime could now witness its downfall firsthand. The symbolism was immediate and universally recognized in Italy. Security remained a constant priority. The partisans ensured that the crowd remained within controlled limits. There were no significant interruptions. The operation proceeded efficiently, reinforcing that Mussolini's death and public display were carefully executed acts of authority rather than random vengeance. Observers, both local and international, recognized the significance of the event. The display demonstrated not only the fall of Mussolini, but also the effectiveness of partisan action in northern Italy. It confirmed that ordinary citizens, organized and determined, could enforce consequences previously reserved for armies or state authority. The display also served as a historical marker. Mussolini's image, suspended and unmistakable, provided future historians with visual evidence of the regime's collapse. It ensured that the conclusion of his life would be remembered clearly, without ambiguity or myth. By evening, the public display had concluded. Mussolini and Petacci's bodies were removed from the girder and placed in temporary storage. The event in Piazzale Loreto had fulfilled its purpose, demonstrating the collapse of fascist authority, communicating justice, and creating a historical record. The operation had achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. It confirmed the partisans' authority, symbolized the consequences of dictatorship, allowed the public to participate in a form of closure, and provided documentation for historical and international audiences. Every step had been deliberate, organized, and executed with precision. The display in Milan marked the final phase of Mussolini's life in the public sphere. His capture, execution, and display together created a sequence of events that defined the conclusion of his rule. The combination of methodical planning, symbolism, and public engagement ensured that the dictator's fall would remain a defining historical moment. In the aftermath, the square returned to normal daily activity, yet the impact of the display lingered. Witnesses carried the memory forward. Newspapers and photographers ensured that Mussolini's death and the method of display were recorded for posterity. It was a moment of closure, accountability, and historical clarity. Mussolini's death in Piazzale Loreto became a reference point in Italian history. The combination of execution and public display illustrated the consequences of absolute power, the role of citizen resistance, and the deliberate use of symbolism in political transitions. For historians and observers, it provided a clear example of the fall of a dictator and the assertion of popular authority in post-war Italy. By the end of April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were no longer living figures, but historical symbols. Their capture, execution, and public display completed a process that demonstrated the collapse of the fascist regime and the capacity of ordinary citizens to assert justice and authority in a post-conflict context. Chapter 4. The Aftermath and Reaction. After Mussolini and Clara Petacci were displayed in Piazzale Loreto, Milan returned to a cautious calm. The immediate spectacle had ended, but the consequences of their deaths continued to unfold across the city, Italy, and the wider world. The dictator's capture and execution marked not only the end of his life, but the definitive collapse of the fascist regime in northern Italy. The Italian public responded in varied ways. For some, the sight of Mussolini's body was confirmation that tyranny had ended. They had lived for years under his rule, witnessing arrests, executions, and the constant oppression of dissent. For them, the event was both closure and vindication. The methodical display in a historically significant square reinforced that justice had been executed. Elsewhere in Italy, news of the executions spread rapidly. Resistance networks and partisan units communicated the outcome to surrounding towns. Civilians in previously occupied areas received confirmation that Mussolini was no longer a threat. This dissemination of information helped to stabilize regions previously under fascist control, allowing for the reassertion of local governance and civic authority. International reaction was swift. Newspapers in Europe and the United States reported the events with vivid detail. Photographs from Piazzale Loreto circulated widely, emphasizing both the method of execution and the symbolic inversion of power. Mussolini's death became a reference point in global discussions of wartime justice and the fall of fascist leadership. Analysts debated the implications, acknowledging that his life had ended decisively and publicly. The display had psychological and political effects. It signaled to remaining fascist supporters that resistance was futile. It also communicated the effectiveness of organized partisan activity, showing that citizen-led groups could influence the course of history. The methodical handling of the execution and the public display reinforced the notion of control and authority, even in a post-conflict environment. For the partisans who had captured Mussolini, the aftermath required careful management. Their goal had been achieved, but maintaining order and avoiding chaos in Milan remained a priority. Civilians had strong emotions, and the partisans needed to balance public participation with discipline. Stones were thrown, voices raised, yet the square remained under control. The operation had been planned to prevent escalation, and their authority ensured that order was maintained. Political figures and emerging authorities began to consider the implications for post-war governance. Mussolini's death created a power vacuum, both locally and nationally. Fascist structures in the north collapsed rapidly. Partisan units transitioned from resistance operations to civil management, overseeing the re-establishment of governance in liberated regions. The executions demonstrated the consequences of the regime's collapse and set a precedent for handling collaborators and officials associated with Mussolini. Historians later noted the significance of the public display in reinforcing political transitions. Piazzale Loreto was not merely a site of revenge. It became a symbol of accountability. Mussolini's fall illustrated that no leader, regardless of power or reach, was immune to consequence. The visibility of his death communicated a message far beyond Milan, emphasizing the end of fascist authority in Italy. The deaths of Mussolini and Petacci also influenced discussions about justice, ethics, and the treatment of captured leaders. Scholars debated the necessity of the public display, weighing the symbolic power against moral considerations. The event was a precedent in the handling of wartime figures, combining execution, public demonstration, and historical documentation. Families affected by Mussolini's policies visited the square or heard reports of the display. For many, it was a moment of validation. The public exhibition allowed citizens to witness directly the consequences of authoritarian rule. The execution and display became a reference point in Italy's collective memory, representing the intersection of justice, history, and societal change. Internationally, Mussolini's death became part of broader discussions about the end of World War II in Europe. Allied forces recognized the significance of removing a major Axis leader from the equation. His death allowed for clearer strategic planning and reduced the likelihood of continued fascist resistance. The removal of Mussolini simplified coordination with Italian authorities and partisan networks during the final days of conflict. The collapse of Mussolini's regime was further reinforced by the rapid surrender and disbanding of remaining fascist units. Leaders who had served under him understood the implications. The chain of command had been broken. Execution and public display underscored the absolute end of authority. Soldiers and officials who might have resisted or fled were now confronted with the certainty of defeat and accountability. In Milan, the square remained a focal point for discussion and observation. Civilians reflected on what had transpired, while partisans and officials ensured that records were maintained. Photographs, reports, and eyewitness accounts created a historical archive. Mussolini's life, capture, execution, and display were documented comprehensively, providing future historians with clear evidence of the sequence of events. The symbolism of Piazzale Loreto extended beyond the immediate context. By displaying Mussolini in the same location where fascist atrocities had occurred, the partisans created a visual narrative of reversal. Authority had shifted. The oppressor was now subject to public scrutiny. This deliberate decision reinforced the narrative of justice and historical closure. Petacci's death and public display also emphasized the personal consequences of power. Those close to Mussolini, whether allies or associates, were not insulated from accountability. Her execution and display underscored that proximity to authority carried tangible risks. This aspect reinforced the broader understanding of responsibility within the fascist hierarchy. The event influenced the Italian transition to post-war governance. Partisans, previously operating primarily as resistance fighters, assumed roles in civil administration. Their actions in managing Mussolini's capture and public display demonstrated organizational capacity and authority, reinforcing their legitimacy as emerging civic leaders. By the end of April 28th, the immediate aftermath in Milan had stabilized. Mussolini and Petacci were no longer present in life, but their deaths and the symbolic display had a lasting effect. Public perception shifted decisively. Fascist influence diminished further, and ordinary citizens recognized the definitive change in authority. The broader historical significance was evident. Mussolini's death and the events in Piazzale Loreto became central to discussions about the fall of authoritarian regimes, wartime justice, and citizen-led enforcement of accountability. It demonstrated that collapse of power could be immediate, visible, and irreversible when combined with organized opposition and clear planning. Reports of the execution and display reached remaining Axis leaders and collaborators. The message was unambiguous. Resistance was no longer viable. Mussolini's fate served as both warning and confirmation of the new political reality. His death marked the conclusion of a dictatorship and the establishment of a transitional period for Italy. The aftermath also shaped international perception. Allied forces and foreign media framed Mussolini's death as the final chapter of a major European fascist leader. It became a reference point in evaluating the consequences of wartime policies and decisions, influencing post-war narratives and historical interpretation. Even weeks later, the events of Piazzale Loreto remained central to Italian discourse. Citizens, officials, and historians revisited the details. The public display had ensured clarity. Mussolini's life had ended, his power had vanished, and the fascist regime he led was no longer operational. Ultimately, the aftermath of Mussolini's death highlighted several key outcomes. Northern Italy transitioned from fascist control to partisan-led administration. Public acknowledgement of accountability established social and political closure. Historical documentation provided clarity for future generations. And the symbolic weight of Piazzale Loreto ensured that the end of Mussolini's authority would not be forgotten. The execution and its public display marked a decisive turning point. Mussolini was no longer a figure of power. His death was comprehensive, both practically and symbolically. Italy had completed a phase of transition, moving from dictatorship to a post-fascist reality, while demonstrating that organized resistance could influence historical outcomes. By the end of the day, Milan had absorbed the full significance of the events. Mussolini's presence had ended. Authority had shifted. Justice, visibility, and historical record had been firmly established. The aftermath set the stage for reconstruction, reflection, and the complex process of post-war governance. Chapter 5. Mussolini's Legacy and Historical Judgment. With Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci dead and the shocking events at Piazzale Loreto concluded, Italy entered a period of profound reckoning. The dictator's life, execution, and public display left an enduring mark on the nation, shaping both political structures and cultural consciousness. His fall became a stark reminder of the consequences of absolute power and the fragility of authoritarian regimes. Mussolini's death had immediate political ramifications. Fascist organizations quickly disintegrated, leaving a vacuum in governance. Partisan units, once focused solely on survival and resistance, assumed new administrative responsibilities, helping restore order in cities, towns, and rural regions. They oversaw the transfer of authority from a defeated regime to nascent civic institutions, highlighting the crucial role of organized civilian intervention in post-war reconstruction. Public reaction to Mussolini's legacy was complex. Many Italians, who had endured repression, censorship, and war, saw his death as justice served. Families mourning, loved ones lost to political purges or military campaigns found a measure of closure, knowing the dictator could no longer wield power. Yet, for loyal supporters, the abrupt end of an era provoked confusion and grief. Mussolini's absence forced them to confront the collapse of the ideals they had long believed in, creating a contested and divided collective memory. Mussolini's policies and leadership style remained central to historical evaluation. His authoritarian rule reshaped Italian politics and society, relying on propaganda, censorship, and the suppression of dissent. Alignment with Nazi Germany further tethered Italy to a destructive wartime agenda. The long-term social and structural consequences of his regime, centralized authority, curtailed civil liberties, and a culture of fear persisted well beyond his death, influencing subsequent political developments and public discourse. The events at Piazzale Loreto intensified the symbolic power of Mussolini's demise. By displaying his body in a location previously associated with fascist violence, partisans communicated a visual narrative of reversal and accountability. The public execution became emblematic, the powerful reduced to vulnerability, the oppressors exposed before those they had subjugated. This image cemented his fall as absolute, turning the site into a lasting symbol of both historical justice and civic empowerment. Historians emphasize the impact of Mussolini's final hours on collective memory. His capture, execution, and public display serve as case studies in the dynamics of power, the consequences of war, and the interplay between authority and accountability. The events illustrated that no leader, however formidable, could withstand organized resistance combined with societal mobilization. Mussolini's death remains a cautionary tale, demonstrating that concentrated authority is never immune to collapse when confronted with civic opposition. The personal dimension of Mussolini's downfall also influenced historical interpretation. Clara Petacci's execution alongside him highlighted the human cost of proximity to power. While debates persist over whether her death was symbolic or punitive, her presence underscored the broader consequences of leadership decisions. Allies, associates, and advisors became implicated by association, showing how authoritarian networks could entangle and endanger those within reach of power. Internationally, Mussolini's death resonated as a tangible marker of wartime justice. Foreign media chronicled the methodical execution and public display, framing the narrative within the context of Allied victory in Europe. Analysts presented it as both an example of accountability and a warning to other authoritarian leaders. The global coverage reinforced the idea that the fall of fascist regimes carried lessons not only for Italians, but for the broader international community confronting confronting totalitarianism. The legal and ethical dimensions of Mussolini's death sparked scholarly debate. Execution without a formal trial raised questions about procedural fairness versus the exigencies of wartime. The combination of summary execution and public display highlighted tensions between symbolic authority and conventional justice. These debates became central to understanding post-conflict morality, the limits of law under crisis, and the role of civilian-led enforcement in shaping historical outcomes. Culturally, Mussolini's legacy inspired literature, journalism, and film. Writers and filmmakers analyzed his rise and fall, exploring the psychological and socio-political dimensions of fascist rule. His capture and public execution provided a framework for storytelling, reflection, and cautionary lessons about power, resistance, and historical memory. The narrative of his demise offered enduring material for both scholarly and popular examination of authoritarianism. Post-war reconstruction in Italy was heavily informed by Mussolini's legacy. Efforts to rebuild governance, civil society, and infrastructure reflected lessons learned from centralized, unchecked power. Citizens engaged in civic processes aimed at creating more transparent and accountable institutions. Mussolini's downfall became a reference point for reform, shaping policies designed to prevent the resurgence of authoritarian control. Piazzale Loreto retained symbolic importance long after the war. The location, site of both fascist violence and Mussolini's public display, became embedded in collective memory. It represented the reversal of oppression, the consequences of unchecked power, and the moral authority of public witness. For future generations, it served as a cautionary emblem of historical justice. The collapse of Mussolini's regime also influenced the trajectory of fascist ideology in Italy. Immediate resurgence was discouraged by the visible consequences of authoritarian rule. While pockets of support persisted, the execution and display of Mussolini made clear the societal cost of such loyalty, creating space for democratic institutions to take root. His legacy, therefore, became both a historical warning and a guidepost for political development. Mussolini's final days, Dongo, execution, and display at Piazzale Loreto are meticulously documented. Partisan reports, photographs, eyewitness testimonies, and international coverage provide comprehensive insight into the events. Scholars continue to analyze these sources to understand the intersection of capture, justice, symbolism, and political transition, highlighting the broader lessons for both Italy and the study of authoritarian regimes. Ultimately, Mussolini's life and death provide a complex historical narrative. He is remembered not only for the consequences of fascist ideology and authoritarian rule, but also for the dramatic and symbolic manner of his downfall. His execution and public display serve as both historical record and moral lesson, reinforcing the principle that no leader is beyond consequence. The events of April 1945 marked the closure of one era and the fragile emergence of another, defined by citizen-led resistance, accountability, and the effort to rebuild Italy on principles of governance and civic responsibility. Mussolini's legacy continues to provoke analysis and reflection. Historians, political scientists, and cultural commentators examine his rise and fall as an example of the dynamics of power, the consequences of authoritarianism, and the role of civic engagement in shaping history. His final hours offer enduring lessons about justice, symbolism, and the moral responsibility of both leaders and citizens. Mussolini's life remains a lens through which the rise and collapse of dictatorships and the enduring strength of civic intervention can be studied and understood. What lessons can we take from the fall of dictators? How would history have changed if Mussolini had escaped? If you found this story compelling, like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most intense moments.